One of the hardest things to do in having a life that's committed to living mindfully, particularly in the early stages, is remembering to be mindful in terms of how you turn up. And of course, what that means is that what you're remembering to do is to not be habitual in terms of your behaviour. And as we've explained many times, there's a lot of research to show that people generally function 95% of the time habitually. Now, that's not all wrong, and it makes life a little bit easier to manage when we don't have to remember all the sort of finer details of how to do things. But what happens is we end up recreating the same life over and over with the same challenges and problems and also the same good things that come out of it, but it becomes very, very difficult for us to create the sorts of things that for many of us are missing. And that's about real joyful quality in our relationships and a sense of fulfillment in our careers and purpose in terms of how we engage life and an increased sense of well-being and health and all the things that we all desire but seem to remain elusive for many of us. So today I want to talk about how we can use the 5 senses as a way to help us to remember to be mindful. Now, the importance of being reminded to be mindful is that, and this is important in terms of the context of what our definition of mindfulness. So the Western mindfulness approach to mindfulness is remembering, remembering in each moment that there's a more self-loving or self-honouring alternative in terms of what would benefit me to what I'm doing habitually. And so being able to stop and remember to do that is a new habit, and we've actually got to develop a new habit about stopping and remembering to be mindful. And so I'm introducing this idea that we can use the 5 senses, and if you have an opportunity to read the blog, you'll read where I give suggestions about how we can use sight and how we can use sound and smell and taste and touch as always different ways that we can be inspired to, in each moment, to stop and consider what the more self-loving alternative might be to what it is that I'm doing right in this moment. And so having the senses involved is really significant because in terms of our state of consciousness, we're using our senses primarily most of the time in order for us to be able to relate to our experience, our human experience. And of course, when any of those senses become compromised, it has a huge impact, of course, on our state of consciousness and the way in which we're able to relate and to be conscious in the world in which we're in. So if you get an opportunity in reading the blog today, here's an opportunity for you to think of ways that you could, for example, use sight as a means of being able to remember to be mindful. And so it could be that you have a reminder that pops up on the wallpaper of your iPhone, for example, or on your computer, so that there's something there that reminds you to be committed to practicing mindfulness instead of functioning constantly habitually. I talk about sound, and I have a good friend of mine who uses a Tibetan gong that sounds on an hourly basis on his phone as a way of reminding him to come back on track in terms of practicing mindfulness. When it comes to taste, you know, so many of us have coffee and tea as an intrinsic part of our day, and we could take the time that we're having our tea or coffee to be a moment where we can practice being reminded to be mindful. And the nice thing about something like tea or coffee is that experience can go on for 10 or 15 minutes while we're taking our time to drink our tea or coffee. So as I relate in the article, this could be an extended opportunity to give consideration to the practice of being mindful. Touch. can be so many different things. It can be the hold of a hand. Any time that somebody holds your hand, your sweetheart or one of your children, that could be a trigger to remind you to practice being mindful. It could be the sensation of a breeze or the wind on your skin. And when you feel that sensation, that you just take that, you associate the recollection of practicing being mindful with that particular experience. And of course, we and I'm just going through the ones. So we've had sight. So in terms of visual prompts, that's right. So this whole idea I talk about, you can get mirror chalk. And having a reminder written on your mirror in the morning, and so when you go in at the beginning of the day and when you go at the end of the day to do your ablutions or whatever it is that you're doing, here's an opportunity for you to take a moment to reflect even through the day. So here's an opportunity to basically set yourself up for the day in terms of your commitment to it. And then at the end of the day, you read this and it's like, well, how well did I go today at being mindful? And it'd be an opportunity for you to review your day, for example. You might use it with brushing your teeth or shaving or something else. And of course the other one was smell. And incense, of course, is a wonderful way of being able to do that. But it could be that you have a favourite perfume or cologne that you wear, and it may be that each time you apply that, or a deodorant that you have, that each time you apply it, you associate an opportunity to stop and reflect on this practice of being mindful. So what is it that you're doing when you're being mindful? You're not applying will or discipline to change your behaviour. Mindfulness is considering in each moment that there's a more self-loving alternative. So mindfulness is literally a programming. If you want to use a word that came out of the 60s and 70s, is brainwashing. Really, that's what mindfulness is. Mindfulness is a way where you literally get to reprogram the brain by constantly considering these more self-loving alternative behaviours. And of course, the interesting phenomenon here is that most of us have this no pain, no gain mentality, this Judeo-Christian sort of concept that you've got to work your ass off in order for change to happen. And in fact, what we're taking in, and I often refer to this as a pragmatically lazy approach. The pragmatic bit is, first of all, beginning to imagine what a more self-loving alternative would be, and the discipline of remembering to remember. Then the lazy part is not using discipline and will to change the behaviour, but to keep on using your energy to recall or to recollect what this more self-loving alternative would look like. What happens is when you commit to doing that, you strengthen the neural pathway associated with that more self-loving alternative. And there's a tipping point where in the scheme of your days or your weeks or your month, there's a day turns up where you're presented with the choice, and the tipping point is that on that day, without any discipline or will or effort being required at all, you make the choice to act in the more self-loving way, because your sense of self-worth, your sense of believing that you're worth it, inspires you to act in a more loving way. And of course, one of the big parts of what it is that we do in EAP is help people to not only understand that, but we also help people to establish a great sense of their worth. Because without that, it's very, very hard to be inspired to be self-loving. If you don't have a sense of your worth, there's no motive or need to act in a self-loving way. And in fact, we're driven by our fear, and we tend to function from a fearful perspective and not a loving one. Anyway, I hope you find this informative and helpful, and look out for more in our series next time that I get to share with you. I'm going to be sharing yet another little insight, another little tool that you could use to help you in the practice of living life more mindfully. And all the best with living a life in mindfulness. Speak to you again soon. Bye.